We try to reduce farm animal suffering, and we do this through education and community outreach, with leaf flitting, we sponsor speaker events, vegan food giveaways, all sorts of things. This is our third annual Beckoff, and it's a week with a bunch of events, sponsoring all sorts of veg type things. Everyone should follow around in the program, and in the program are listed all the events for the week. On Thursday, there's a potluck at Kaufman, 6 p.m. And on Friday at the Kaufman Kitchen is a veg demo with 2 sewer cop deli chefs, Chris Kraft and Tom Cotton. Also is our veg pledge. I don't know if you noticed outside when you walked in, but we'll be giving out veg care packs to anyone who sign up for the veg pledge. And what it is pledging to be a vegetarian or a vegan for a week. And we'll give you a little card with discounts and all those things. So sign up after the show, and also we'll be giving out a little prize card to win a prize.
There,
yeah.
by the
So thank you so much.
yeah, get some better shots.
Yeah, that's really good.
Good evening, my name is Erica and I'm with the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund. We are the animal rights group over at the law school, and we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event tonight with Compassionate Action for Animals. If anyone's interested in getting more involved with us, we do have a sign-up sheet outside. One thing to mention is that right now we're looking for someone who wants to go to an animal law conference in Portland in 2 weeks. We have a little bit of funding. So if anyone's interested in animals and the law and would like to talk to us more about this conference, certainly talk to us afterwards. Thank you all for being here and have a great night.
Hi. Finally, I'm up here to introduce the main event, Mark Beckoff. So I'm Emily King, and I'm with CAA, and CAA and Student Animal Legal Defense Fund are so happy to have Mark here. He is a world-renowned animal behaviorist and biologist, as well as a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I'd love to stand up here and gush about all the books he's written and awards he's won and great work he's done with Jane Goodall, but I know that Mark and his research can speak for themselves. So here he is, Mark Beckoff.
Who's watches this? Who is it? Oh, okay, great. I'll give it back to you. It's a nice watch, actually. So, thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And can that light be dim just a touch? I feel like I need sunblock. Okay, well, they won't. Anyway, it's really great to be here. And what I'd like to do is make a few general comments about some of the work I do, and some general comments about the state of the world in terms of cruelty to animals. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here for the most part. And then what I'll do is run you through a slideshow of mostly slides that I've taken on various trips, and talk to you about animal emotions. So let me frame what I'm going to say. Sometimes it's just easier to give you an idea of where I'm going to go in my talk, and then I will be returning to a lot of these points as the talk progresses. I like to think of animal emotions as what I call gifts of our ancestors. I think it's a question of why animal emotions have evolved, or why animals have emotions, not if animals have emotions. Some of my colleagues actually ponder whether dogs or cows or chickens or turkeys or pigs have feelings or emotions. And to me, that's a silly waste of time. If they want to do it, it's okay for them to do it. But I think it's very clear that certain animals have emotions and have deep feelings. I don't know about mosquitoes, but if we want to know about mosquitoes, let somebody study them before we conclude that they don't. So I just want to really set the stage that, to me, it's just a no-brainer that certain animals certainly have rich and deep emotional lives. Another main point is that I think their emotional lives are public. You read stories about, or books about the hidden life of dogs, the secret life of rabbits, the private life of monkeys. And I'm thinking, my God, I mean, a dog's wagging his tail or a pig squealing when his testicles are cut off with a scissors is telling you something very publicly about what they're feeling. So I think it's just a myth to think that their lives are private. They're no more private in many ways than our lives. And some people say, well, you know, you can be wrong about attributing certain emotional states to animals. And yeah, you can be wrong, and you can be wrong with people, but that doesn't mean that we deny that people have emotions or people other than ourselves. So it's good biology, it's good evolutionary biology to assume that many animals have feelings and passions. Following up on Charles Darwin, who was a very famous biologist, the differences between humans and other animals and the differences among other animals are differences in what we call degree rather than kind. And Darwin put forth this idea called evolutionary continuity, where he argued that the differences are continuous. They're shades of gray among species, not black and white. So if we have a heart, other animals have hearts. If we have a kidney, other animals have their own sorts of kidneys. If we have emotions, animals have their sorts of emotions. They don't necessarily have to be the same as ours. So there can be dog joy and cat joy and pig pain and human pain. But you can't conclude from the fact that their emotions aren't like ours, that they don't have emotions, because we could just as easily conclude that we don't have emotions, but they do. So I think that good science, common sense really does argue about the presence of animal emotions. There's a couple of things I wanted to mention. It's National Vegetarian Week, World Vegetarian Week actually, so I would certainly encourage all of you who are vegetarians to begin the process of becoming vegetarians, and you might not do that overnight, but it might happen. So sometimes it's a slow process, but I would encourage you all to start thinking that way. I've got a few little one-liners I like. I like people who say, well, you know, I really love animals. You know, I really love dogs, I love cats, I love cows, and then they go out and eat or shoot them. And I always say, well, I'm glad you don't love me. Another major point, and there's sort of like a sarcastic side to it, but there's also a very, I think, academic side, is I don't understand how environmentalists can eat meat. Because if you put ethics aside, which of course you can't, the environmental and ecological destruction from factory farming and other activities like that are deplorable, they're ubiquitous, and they just ruin the land. So I always get into arguments with people about that. But I actually really believe that if you're really into the environment and you don't think much about animal rights or animal welfare or animal protection, it's a pretty hard argument to put forth that it's still okay to eat meat. Now, another set of questions I also ask, and you'll see where this is coming from later in my talk, is talk to people about, the question is, would you do it to your dog? And what I mean there is, would you do to your dog what you do to other animals or allow other people to do to other animals? And it always forces people sort of to internalize the struggle if they have a struggle. And sometimes they say, well, no. And I will go, why? So here's a little story. I visited a university a couple of years ago, and the names have been changed to protect the guilty. And so I talked to a colleague who I call Bill, and he had a dog named Reno, and Bill walked into the room. And I said, hey, Bill, how are you? He said, fine. I said, how's your dog Reno? I'd met them a couple of years before. And he said, Reno's great. Reno gets happy when he plays. He looks forward to going to the play park. He gets jealous when I give attention to my daughter. He gets angry when I leave the house and just tears the kitchen apart. It just goes on and on and on, and he's really bright, and he can beat Bill at chess and all that kind of stuff. And so I gave my talk, and then Bill's hand was the first hand that went up and said, oh, Mark, you know, you're being a little too reckless here. You're being anthropomorphic. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. You don't really know whether these animals have emotions or feel emotions. So I kind of sat there, and it had been a long day. And I said, Bill, would you like to tell the audience about Reno? And there was this hesitation, and he went, well, you know what I mean. And I said, no, I don't know what you mean. You just told me how emotional Reno was. but yet in your day job, you come in and you torture animals. And that's when I said, would you do it to your dog? So I throw that out. The serious side is that our relationship with other animals is complex, and it's frustrating, and it's challenging. But it doesn't mean that we can't do better. So sort of my other one-liner is that we can always do better. No matter how well we think we're doing, we can always do better. And in the end, for people who are skeptical about people who want to protect animals, you could also argue, and I could certainly give you references, that better welfare, better animal well-being produces better and more reliable data in scientific studies. Time and again, we're discovering that over and over in different disciplines. So once again, it doesn't have to be motivated purely by a concern for animals, although it would be nice if that were the case. It can be motivated by doing better science or by doing less harm to the environment. So what I'd like to do now is I'm just going to use my slides here to make some points, and then I'll show a video. It's my third PowerPoint presentation, so bear with me. The first 3 slides just are the name of the talk. Happy Hounds. I'm going to talk about play in animals in a bit. Pissy baboons. The story about pissy baboons comes from the work of a man named Robert Sapolsky, who's a very famous neurobiologist, ethologist. He wrote a book called Primate Memoirs. And he tells a story about Nick, a really rambunctious baboon who joined a group in late childhood, if you will. And this is what Sapolsky says, and it's great. He says, Nick was confident, unflinching, and played dirty. During a fight with Reuben, another adolescent male, Reuben stuck his ass up in the air, a sign of submission, but Nick went over as if to examine his bottom and then slashed Reuben's butt with his canines. To quote Sapolsky, the guy simply wasn't nice. He harassed the female, swatted at kids, bullied ancient gums and limb. Then he tells a story of how he started picking on a female named Ruth. And one of the advantages of being a small female in baboon troops is you can run out on small limbs and trees where the big males can't go. So Ruth ran out on a limb, and she thought she was safe. She looked around feeling really confident. Nick went to a branch above her and peed. So that's where pissy baboons go. There's actually a story there too, because it's quite innovative, and I'm going to talk about that. And playing pigs. These are actually pigs at a pig park. And it's just really nice in contrast to the pictures that you've seen. Is there any way to make this light a little dimmer? No, seriously, it's killing me. Okay. So these are animals, of course. I'm just going to start off with some gory pictures, and I'll weave in a few more gory pictures. But of course, these are just, pigs cramped into stinking, rotten cages where they're tortured. I mean, slaughterhouses are torture chambers. I mean, let's just, face it. They're prisons where animals really suffer. This I copied off of the Compassion for Animals website. And this next one is tiny, but it actually came out okay. I wanted to make the point that these are birds shut up in little battery cages. And it gives you the cringes, and I could have made it larger, but this is how narrow their lives are. And these are some data. I mean, there's more modern data, maybe up to date, but they're actually hard to get because there's very few laws that cover animal use in factory farming, and people don't know how many animals die on the way to slaughterhouses, how many die there, how many downed animals. But just look at these numbers. I know you can all read, but it's about 8 or 9 animals a second are slaughtered. So if I talk for 60 minutes, you'll have to do the math. But anyway, it's a lot of seconds and a lot of animals. Some people work for animals, and Temple Grandin works to make the lives of animals better. And on the one hand, it's a very difficult situation. I mean, she does work to make the lives of farmed animals better by designing better chutes and better conditions in slaughterhouses. But she and I got into an argument, actually in scientific literature, because she wrote a paper and she talked about different techniques that were, quote, relatively humane. And I wrote back thinking, well, that notion of something being relatively humane is like being relatively pregnant. I mean, either you are or you're not. And so I suppose there might be different shades of gray in the notion of humaneness versus pregnancy, but this was a response. She said, if I visualize myself as an animal, I would willingly walk into the modified ASPCA pens. I wouldn't. Would you? So I'm just showing this because, once again, it demonstrates how complicated our relationship with other animals are. But believe me, the best of the best is still horrible. And this is one of my favorite quotes. Alice Walker, who you all know is an author, I just discovered I'm going to be on a program with her in March. And I never really realized that she wrote a lot about animals. And this is a quote from, if you don't know the essay, Am I Blue? It's all about a horse named Blue. It's just one of the most moving essays you ever could have imagined reading. And you can basically read the quote. That when you eat meat, you're eating misery. When you eat meat, you're eating stress. And you're incorporating it into your body, and you're changing your life that way. So, this is one of my favorite slides, because it's one of my favorite bumper stickers. I do science. I am a scientist. I love science. I'm critical of science because I don't think science is the only show in town. And I surely don't think that science is the objective enterprise that people make it out to be. I.e., scientists are human beings that come to the table with values and biases just like we do. Everyone does. So to say that science is objective, I think, is silly. Even physicists disagree about the nature of life. So I show you this just because of the fact that if science were really value-free, then I wouldn't have critics throwing barbs at me. They might just write me off as being crazy, but they certainly wouldn't say, that's bad science, but what I do is good science. So I show you this because it's sort of the posturing of science. As Beckoff man, I'm a scientist. If you saw Ghostbusters, Harold Ramis, as the mad scientist, actually said this when they were looking for ghosts around New York. So, how can you view animals? Well, there's many different levels of concern. And I'm going to show you a few slides just to introduce you, and if you were working down the little chain, you can be concerned with species or ecosystems or populations of animals. So you might be concerned that a particular species is going extinct or losing members. And you might say that in order to save the species, I'm concerned with species and the integrity of an ecosystem, we need to move animals around, and some animals might die. So an example might be the very successful reintroduction program in Yellowstone Park, for example, raises all the difficult questions. Is it okay to trade off the life or rights of an individual for the good of their species? Okay? I'm not going to answer those questions now. We can talk about them later. So you can be concerned with lions. This is a picture I took last year, actually, in the Serengeti in Africa. Animals who are urbanized, hanging around. This was a hyena in the road, didn't seem to be very disturbed at all. Kind of looked up, shrugged, and actually then went back to sleep. People in a lot of countries are just interested in numbers, not individuals. I, myself, am interested in individual animals. I think that question of whether we should trade off the life of an individual wolf for the good of his or her species is no, the answer to that question is no. And then we can start working about how to do projects that might be good for ecosystems and other things, but not say that, well, 50% will die. Canadian lynx were reintroduced into the state of Colorado about 6 years ago, and we got very upset because the Division of Wildlife there, basically in their public disclosures, said we fully expect half the animals to die when they're reintroduced. So 4 out of the first 5 animals starved to death. And starving to death is not a pleasant death. There's many other more pleasant deaths, if you will. So we stopped that, and we protested, and they changed the way in which they reintroduce the animal. So activism always works. But I tell you that because they were fully happy to say that 1 out of 2 animals would die. I mean, would you go to work if you only had half a chance of getting there? I mean, I would. So the top of this slide got cut off, but it says, sometimes I wish I could pee on everything in the whole wide world. And the reason I show you this slide is because as an ethologist, or someone who studies animal behavior, I'm very interested in how animals communicate with one another and with us, and the fact that many animals are not visual animals like we are. They depend on sounds and smells, odors that we can't hear. So this is always just a reminder that dogs, who we know well, cows, pigs, the animals who are all kept in slaughterhouses and used for food, communicate with one another in very subtle ways to which we don't have access. So a good example would be a dog, just to sort of bring it home to people who know dogs better than other animals. My dog Jethro used to love to go to the veterinarian, and he'd jump out of the car, jump in the office, wag his tail, try to play with everyone there. And shortly before he died, I brought him in, and he walked in, and all of a sudden he stopped, he lowered his body, his ears went back, his tail was tucked, and he started shaking. And I thought, there's something very weird here, because he felt really good when I left the house. Turns out that the dog before him had been stressed and scared and released what's called a pheromone. And although they cleaned up the examination room really well, Jethro's sense of smell was keen enough to pick it up. So the vet came out and said, oh, everything's okay. Don't worry about Jethro. The dog before was stressed. So that's just a good example. And then you think of ultrasound in bats and the infrasound, the really low frequency noises that elephants make that they can rumble through the land for 10 or 15 kilometers. So this just reminds you that animals communicate in different ways. So cows in slaughterhouses, pigs in slaughterhouses, not only see misery and death, they hear it and they smell it. They're immersed in it. Not pleasant. Anthropomorphism. Let me just deal with that as quickly as I can. People will say, oh, you're just being anthropomorphic. And being anthropomorphic means that you're attributing human characteristics to non-human animals. That's a simple way. And my response is, there's no substitute. If I want to talk about an animal, what the animal is thinking or feeling, I have to use human terms in whatever language I know. You need to do it carefully, but there's no other way to keep the context. I can describe to you what an animal is doing when they move a bicep or a tricep, or when dopamine increases in the brain, or some other chemical changes cycling through their body. But the fact of the matter is, I have to use human terms. It's doing what comes naturally. And the critics will often say, well, look at that. You thought that dog was happy, but it was aggressive. Well, so what? Nothing's perfect. Surely science isn't perfect. And so I just sort of dispense with it because no one has offered an alternative. Some of the behavioral psychologists will talk about stimulus and response type of mechanisms, but you don't really learn very much from that. Okay, it's much richer vocabulary, and it's very easy, in a sense, to use the terms. This comes from a zoo. It says, do you know someone with a habit, biting their nails, tapping their foot, twirling their hair? Goes on and says, Sasha has lots of toys and attentive keepers. She still retains this habit. This doesn't cause her any harm, and she even does it when she's in a good mood. And so I show you this because this is at a zoo, and they talk about Sasha being in a good mood. Remember that for a second. And this might be more difficult than using words such as these to describe animals. It's called anthropomorphism. As you observe the animals in the zoo, ask, what are they doing instead of how do they feel? Right. So let me tell you another story. Stories are great. Former head of the American Zoo and Aquarium Association, otherwise known as the AZA, got very upset at me and a bunch of people for saying that Ruby, an elephant in the Los Angeles Zoo, was unhappy. She had been shipped here and there, was now back in the zoo after being in a sanctuary, and was moping around. And he said, Mark Beckoff and other people are just being anthropomorphic when they say Ruby is unhappy. Look at her. She's happy. Okay, good. You got it. Sometimes people sit there and go, wait a minute. So, of course, the question is it's a double standard. It's just dribble. Why can he say she's happy and I and other people can't say she's unhappy? Enough. I mean, it's like Bill and Reno. It's just kind of playing the middle from both ends. And when you catch the people doing it, it makes for a nice discussion. So, let me run through some slides now about different animal emotions. The basic argument, because I study animal behavior, is that behavior is central to understanding what animals feel. There's a lot of research being done now in non-invasive neurobiology where they do MRIs and they do PET scans. And as those techniques develop, we're going to learn more and more about animal emotions. And as these techniques are being used slowly, we are learning that a lot of our intuitions are supported very much by scientific data. Once again, if you're a good Darwinian, you're not shocked. It's nice to learn about the common mechanisms, but it's certainly not shocking to discover that monkeys don't like, female monkeys don't like to have their mothers ripped, their children ripped away from them. And I'll return to that. So, let me run through a few questions. Can animals form friendships? There was actually a paper written in a scientific journal a few years ago that asked this question and debated it. So, well, how do we define friends? Well, they might be two individuals who eat together, groom one another, defend food, go out for dinner, sleep together, protect their apartment, go to a ball game, eat cotton candy, I don't know, whatever. But they're animals who prefer one another, spend a lot of time with one another, interact with one another closely. These two chimpanzees, can you say these two chimpanzees are friends? Yes, I think you safely can say that they're friends and that animals form friendships. And I'll show you a few slides and you'll see how this argument develops. Another is, I know it does do that. Oh, no, really? Well, this is a mated pair of foxes. Do they love one another? Well, I don't think humans have any purchase on the notion of love. I mean, after all, I told you about people who love animals and then they kill them. So I'm just thinking that, you're right, don't love me, don't love anybody in my family, that's fine. You can love animals, but it's very perverse, I think, really. It's something that we really need to think twice about. At least getting in an elevator with these people. So, do animals love one another? Well, this is a mated pair. This pair happened to be a pair of foxes who mated for a few years. Whenever the female came into estrus, they courted vigorously every year. Just like humans, right? They just love one another, they reunite, they reform their bonds, they court one another, they sleep close to one another. There's cooperative breeding, they help, other animals help to rear the young, they travel together, they defend one another. Do they love one another? Yeah, I think it's safe to say that they love one another. There's certainly nothing lost by saying that they love one another. And if you want to play the scientific game, which is fine, figure the criteria that we use to define love in humans and then apply it to other animals. And once again, it's just a no-brainer. You can say red foxes love one another. When they're apart, they miss one another. They seek one another out. If you give them preference tests, they prefer one another. So you can run the whole gamut of, if you will, objective tests and draw that conclusion. Animals love one another between species. I picked this slide because it reminds me of my dog Jethro. And Jethro used to save animals. I live in the mountains outside of Boulder, and he brought a baby bunny home to me once that was about the size, smaller than half the size of my fist. He brought a bird home who had flown into a window. And many of you have probably read about the hippopotamus and the tortoise, who formed a very strong friendship after the tsunami. There's a great situation at a zoo in Japan. A poisonous predatory snake who just gulps down hamsters left and right befriended a hamster. So now there's pictures of the snake with a hamster sitting on his back eating other hamsters. I mean, so besides the fact that the providing the hamsters is something we need to talk about, that would be an improbable relationship. So there's many examples. There's a lioness in Samburu, and I'll show you pictures. I was there last year, who befriended baby oryx, baby gazelle, antelopes, 5 times. Not once. So these improbable relationships do form. And I like this because it supports an idea that I have and many other people have of some kind of universal compassion. There is this compassion. We tend to overlook it in war-torn societies, but there's a lot of compassion out there among humans as well as among non-human animals. This is from a shelter in Bangladesh, an abused and abandoned monkey and dog. The dog was there first, the monkey came in, saw the dog, they hug one another, they're inseparable. When you separate them, they cry, they scream and squeal. When they come back together, they hug one another. Are they friends? This is from studies of Jane Goodall. This is Flint, who was a normal 8.5-year-old chimpanzee when his mother Flo died. And right after Flo died, Flint stopped eating, stopped playing, stopped traveling with his group, resisted the temptations of other chimps to invite him along, and subsequently this picture was taken right before he died. Was he grieving? And these are animals in cages. This is a macaque mother and a baby in a laboratory cage. And some people say, get upset when someone says, well, these are prisons. I mean, look at that. I mean, if that's not a prison, what is? I actually work in prisons, and I can tell you that this is a prison. A baboon and a vice in a xenotransplantation experiment. A moon bear in China in a crush cage. I'll show you a happy, because this is a bear named Jasper, to whom I've just dedicated my new book. Moon bears stay in these cages for upwards of 20 years, like this. They're lying down. And the top of the cage comes down and crushes them and squeezes bile out of their gallbladder for the traditional Chinese medicine business. I'm actually going there in a bit because I really want to work with these bears. And that's Jasper, the same bear, 2 years later. He's like the ambassador or the spokesbear for hope, if you will. Jill Robinson, I'll show you a picture of her later, who works with these animals, is amazed at their forgiveness. This was a bear who was in one of those cages for quite a long time and came out, rehabbed, likes people after being tortured forever. So anyway, if you don't think there's hope, think Jasper. This is Jane with Emma, a female. This was just taken last year. And Emma had just been delivered, if you will, to Jill's sanctuary. So they come in all different shapes and sizes, but most of them are severely malnourished with severe injuries, not only, of course, physical, but psychological. So one of the questions that people often ask me, I'm going to use mother-infant interactions as an example. They go, well, is there any sort of research that shouldn't be done? What do you think? And I think that's a fair question. A lot of people hem and haw, but I don't. I think mother-infant research in which infants are taken away from mothers, like Harry Harlow did years ago. Some of you may know his work that was done at the University of Wisconsin. We don't need to do that research anymore. You could argue it should never have been done, but we surely don't have to do it anymore. These are olive baboons. Very close relationships, very nurturing mothers. This was a pride of lions in the Gorogoro crater. Mother very protective. These pups had been playing and they ran over and started nipping at a big male who became very upset very fast. She was retrieving the pups and then would stand over them, like the little one in the middle, almost saying, "Oh, Mom, can I go play now?" And I show you these because, of course, if you've been a mother, then you know how strong that bond is, and to be surprised or to think that you need to investigate what happens when you rip babies away from their mothers seems to me to be very poor biology. I mean, how could you even imagine that that wouldn't happen. And so that would be one area of research. These are zebras in the lower crate, a baby zebra suckling a mom. So, of course, across species you see this. What other sorts of research might we get rid of? Well, I think we could get rid of research called learned helplessness. This is research where animals are trained to avoid a shock and then are not allowed to avoid the shock. And they go crazy. So extreme social isolation, learned helplessness, extreme food deprivation, extreme restraint of putting animals in chairs and basically tying them down. That sort of research just does not need to be done anymore. So I just wanted to tell you that because I think that it's a very fair question to ask, and there are innumerable areas in which we could answer that. So, let me tell you about elephants, because elephants are really amazing animals. When we were in Africa last year, we hooked up with Ian Douglas Hamilton. Some of you might have heard of him. Formed a great organization called Save the Elephants, and we went out flying with Ian in Samburu, which is in northern Kenya. And Ian is an amazing person. He's devoted his life in the same way that Jane Goodall and other people have, Diane Fossey, for example, have devoted their lives to saving species. So I just use elephants because they're the poster child. When you turn on TV now or you go to magazines, one day I saw 5 different ads for either life insurance or something else which used elephants. So elephants are in, but they're a good model. Are they emotional? Yes, they are. These are them taking a mud bath. But let me tell you another story. When we got there, we went out, and there was a group of elephants. The individuals were walking around. Their bodies were low to the ground. The tails were down. The ears were down. And they looked lost. So I said to Ian, there's something wrong here. And he said, yes, the matriarch died. That's the female who is like the social glue for the group. When the matriarch dies, groups often dissolve. She has a lot of traditional knowledge. She leads the group, and other individuals really look up to her because elephant societies are strongly matriarchal. About 2 kilometers down the road, there were elephants running around and playing with the matriarch really centered. So the reason I tell you that is, with no real experience watching elephants, it was just so clear by watching them that something was brutally wrong. And what was brutally wrong was the mother had died, the matriarch had died, and these animals didn't know what to do. They live in large groups, very protective of the young. And oftentimes a young elephant will walk around and just touch other individuals with his or her trunk, forming bonds, maintaining the bonds. They're very strongly social, and they form very cohesive groups. You can see them walking there. There's an elephant right in the middle. And they're large. I just show you this because this wasn't even the largest of the elephants we saw. And right behind the wildebeest. And when the big males come on the scene, it's thunderous. It's in a car with a group of people, and we basically were parked right in between, or right within a group of elephants. And I sort of glanced to the left. We were taking some data, and I see this elephant coming at me a little too fast. So I said to George, who was the driver, George Whittemire, what should I do? And he said, well, you can't do anything. Just sit. Yeah, that's great. Just sit. Well, the elephant ran to the car, stopped, could have basically forklifted the car over, looked at me, and then swatted the front of the car with his trunk, just to say, this is my place, but you can be here. About 2 days later, we were taking data. We went out to collect elephant poop. Has anybody ever done that here? Well, it's a really interesting venture. And basically, it's not only done for humane and ethical reasons, but it's also extremely scientifically rich to collect dung, because you can assess what the animals have been eating, you can assess reproductive status, and you can do hormone analyses using elephant dung. So I had another experience. I'd never done that before, and I thought that wouldn't that make for great discussion around Thanksgiving dinner? It doesn't. Let me just tell you. But I also had an elephant pass gas on me. We were sitting in the car, and Hua, a female, came up And she started just rocking and went, not quite like that, but you know, you get the idea. But the point I'm trying to make is that these animals who could have just, I mean, they just could have killed us, maimed us, were very social. I'm sure there are people in here who've been around wild elephants. And they are extremely gregarious. These are sort of like small, medium, large, and extra large. They hanging out together. This was actually part of a core group. But yet, this is what happens to them. It says, of course, things are slightly different in the wild. And so, you can tie this together into, of course, the way in which food animals are treated. I can make the same spiel. There's recent research that showed that cows, individual cows, can be very moody. They get upset and they get very, very moody when they are separated from their friends. There was also a recent research project on sheep that showed that sheep form very strong social preferences, and they can remember the faces of many other animals. And when given preference tests, of course, they prefer the faces of their other animals, showing they're smart, they're sentient, they're emotional. Recent work done, a lot of work done on chicken cognition, showing that chickens are very smart, they can really solve a lot of problems, and they can remember very complex dominance relationships within the group. Recent research on fish, people go, well, fish don't feel pain. Yeah, fish feel pain. There's really good data that show that fish feel pain. I don't think fish feel human pain, but neither do humans feel fish pain. But there's no doubt that fish feel pain. So when a fish is caught and thrown back in after having his or her mouth ripped apart by a hook, probably not a pleasant experience. The point there is, oh, here's something going on. The point is that as people do more and more research on other animals, they're discovering more and more about what we have, if you will, the intuition of feeling, that other animals, like fish or trout, you know, don't feel pain, they'll say, and we know that that is not so. One of my areas that I've studied is play behavior, and I'll just tell you about it because I think play is just a great example of joy in animals. Animals love to play, they seek it out, they do all the things they have to do to get other individuals to play. These are two wildebeest playing. You can tell that they control their behavior. Look at their horns. I mean, if you got pierced with a horn like that, or they were, it would be very serious. Watch this young hippo run, rhino run circles for hours, dashing here and there, and his mother, it's kind of a lesson in mother-infant interactions as well as just pure, raw joy. This hippo was just running figure eights all over the place, and the mother just kept turning around like that. Just, really, it's like she was on a turret. And it was a really great picture. Young gorillas playing. Watch elephants play. They will very often play by putting their trunk on the top of the head of the other, and their tusks would go side by side. And then we watched this for 4 hours. They would just rock. It was like a dance. They'd rock back and forth, go front and back. And they would do that. And they'd like fake left and go right. And then they'd step back and assess one another and move towards one another so gently. It was just a very beautiful dance. These are the same two. Sometimes an elephant will come up behind another elephant and drop the trunk. Let me see what the slide is in. Yeah, and of course there's dog play. These are coyotes playing. I studied coyotes in Jackson Hole for years. You just see it all the time. And I love this one. This is a mother playing with her young. You've got to have a lot of faith in this. Let me just see it the next slide. Yeah, you can't read that one. Well, let me go back to this. So let me tell you about an idea that I've been working on before I sort of go into some practical activism type of part of my talk. Think of what you do when you play, and animals do just about the same. Play is a voluntary activity, and think of dogs, and you can generalize it to cows and pigs and wolves and chimpanzees. When animals play, they use the same actions as they use in other contexts. So they'll use actions that you see during dominance relationships, actions during predatory interactions, actions that you see during courtship and mating and reproduction. So somehow they have to tell one another, I want to play with you, not fight with you or mate with you or eat you. And what we've discovered over the years, and I'll show you a little video clip, is that animals really negotiate these relationships very, very carefully. So the point I want to make, and I'll show you a couple of minutes of a video and then come back to conclude, is that play is a great area of research because, number one, it shows clearly that the animals are doing things intentionally on purpose. It also is a great marker for joy. It has been work done on play in rats that show that rats show very similar neurochemical changes as do humans when they're anticipating play. And the reason I just tell you that, because once again, who would have ever guessed that? One of the reasons, of course, rats are studied rather than dogs or wolves is because you can then homogenize their brains and do the chemical work. But I'm just saying that there are really good examples throughout the animal kingdom, once again, that we share brain structures and share emotions. Okay? So let me show you this. This is going to take a minute. I'm not good at this. Hit escape. So that's where you're somewhere in. Okay? And now review. Sam?
Is trust. Every player must feel assured that it's safe, that the other animal intends no harm. Humans rely on nearly 6,000 languages to communicate friendly intentions, while animals seem to do very well without any words at all. The nature of play is that it closely resembles many other activities in an animal's life. During each play bout, youngsters may practice a variety of survival skills. Pretend mating might be followed by running away, followed by mock fighting, and then, of course, some more pretend mating. In this kaleidoscope of activity, the players need to reassure each other that they're being invited to romp, rather than challenged to fight. So they tell each other with signals. It's the language of play.
Play signals are an interesting thing to look at because in animals who are closely related, like coyotes, wolves, and dogs, and foxes, they're pretty much the same play signals. You see the play bow, you see the pawing, you see this sort of high amplitude running gait. And the reason that they're all the same is because they have to be very obvious, very clear play signals. You can't yell, come play with me. So the way they yell, come play with me, is they do a play bow. There's always a chance that play signals will be misunderstood, and then play could grade into fighting, and that's a risk. But in many species, play signals are unique to play. They're very unambiguous and very clear, but there always is the risk, but that's probably part of why play is so carefully negotiated, is because it could be risky and have it break into aggression.
Having lived with dogs for thousands of years, humans can easily tell when they're playing. Dogs have even taught us how to signal in their language. But as an expert in animal behavior, Dr. Mark Beckoff has made a specific study of play communication.
Right now, this is wrestling. This is role reversal. This is classic. Izzy could clearly nail Parker, but he trusts that Parker won't bite him and won't do anything to disturb the rules of the game. And if you notice, Izzy's taking Parker's legs in his mouth. When he could snap that leg off in a heartbeat, but he won't do it. When animals play, you have to look at the whole body. A wagging tail in and of itself may not mean anything. It may mean the animal's excited. But when you combine the wagging tail and the ears are up a bit,
and the animal is walking in a very light gait and goes like that, then that's play. Unmistakably play.
I think one of the things that people don't realize that if you want to understand animal play is you got to film it and you got to watch it frame by frame because you need the details. When you do the analyses frame by frame, you'll see that they're continually adjusting their behavior. There'll be real quick eye contact. Izzy might do something that Parker doesn't like, and Izzy will tell him to stop doing it with his eyes. You'll see that they orient so that the bites don't grab a loose lip. If you notice, they never bite the eye. They don't yank at the ears very much. And they're making continual micro adjustments when they play. So what we're seeing now is classic mutual symmetrical wrestling play. This is as good as it gets for dogs. I think people ought to do this more.
Dolphins can't communicate their intention to play exactly as dogs do. With their permanent smiles, they always look playful. But looks can be deceiving. Dolphin playing and fighting are very similar. So they depend on subtle differences in gestures to know whether an action is playful or deadly. Dr. Kathleen Dudzinski is an expert in dolphin communication.
When dolphins are playing, they'll use a lot of the same signals as they use when they're fighting. But when they're playing, they modify those signals with different angles of approach from behind or from the side. When they're fighting, there'll be head-to-head angles of approach, very direct, very harsh movements. Also, when dolphins are playing, there's a lot of affectionate rubbing. But when they're fighting, there's no affectionate rubbing. Dolphins are strong animals. They're 200 to 300 pounds. They have a lot of sharp teeth. You know, they could hurt each other. They could kill each other. So they need a place that's safe to learn how to use these signals. It's play.
Feeling safe when you play is very important, especially when you're interacting with an animal who can beat you up. So that safety comes from trust. Play a little, you test one another out, you assess one another, and then you go, oh gee, even if I bite them, they'll play. Even if I mount them, they'll play. So that safety factor is critical. So if you feel unsafe and you're stressed, you
So, the major point from there, and you can see it in many animals, and it's something I'm working on, is it's the notion that animals know right from wrong, and that you will see it in play. And so just to tell you some of the things we found, not only do animals carefully negotiate play, they invite other animals to play. They say, I want to play with you, and if I bite you, or if I mount you, or if I bite you and shake my head from side to side, it's not to be meant, it's not meant to be interpreted as, say, an aggressive or a predatory or necessarily a mating move. But what we found studying dogs, coyotes, and wolves was fascinating, and we're still pursuing this, is they do this thing called a play bow. You've probably all seen it. They'll crouch, put their butts up, they'll bow, wag their tail, sometimes bark. And so not only is that used to solicit play, but what we discovered was that these animals use them very strategically. They use them statistically more right before or right after they bite and vigorously shake their head from side to side. The first example would be, I bow and bite to say, I'm going to bite you. I'm going to shake my head from side to side really vigorously, but don't take it as an aggressive move. The second would be, right after a bite, I'm sorry, forgive me if I hurt you, let's play. And that's being strongly anthropomorphic, but the fact of the matter is the data show that hyenas seem to do that, and now there's some very good research on chimpanzees that show that they control the way they use facial expressions in play. So the bottom line is very careful studies are really showing that animals, when they play, are doing very complicated moves, but they're keeping track of what they're doing, and they're forgiving one another, they're apologizing, and they are playing. And once again, maybe if you haven't thought about it, go to a dog park and you'll see this all the time. So what does this all mean? I want to run through some slides because I think one of the really important things about studying animals, not only their emotions, but studying them and being with them, is recognizing what people do and what, of course, we shouldn't do. So one thing is, I can tell you right now, that animals are invariably telling us to stay off of their backs, if you will. And this just comes from a Greenpeace sign, stay off of my forest home. Leave me alone. One of the major conclusions from my work and Jane Goodall's work and other people's work is animals have a point of view. They have likes and dislikes, they have preferences, there are things they like better than others, and that's a no-brainer. But what it also means is that we need to care for animals. So I just run through some slides. One of the activities I do a lot of is with a group called Roots and Shoots, which has a very strong representation actually in Minneapolis and Minnesota. It's a group that Jane formed in Tanzania, dedicated to increasing appreciation and respect for animals, people, and the environment. And here are some drawings. This is by Savannah. It says, I have a dream that there will be no more homeless pets. Shows the homeless pets and then their rooms at a house. We also ask kids, what are they thankful for? I am thankful for nature. This is a baby giraffe eating some leaves on a tree. But I show you this is because my dream is that butterflies will be free. I mean, if you really want to make the world a better place, go to the kids and get them early. I'm thankful for Satan, Joey, Chipper, and Buddy. My dream is that all animals will be safe. My dream is that my cats will be happy. I do this with senior citizens. I do it with kids. I do it with prisoners. The work I do with prisoners is rewarding. We've done a bilingual book called The Book of Hope, and one of my favorite prisoners was a former tattoo artist, an excellent artist. So these people are making a difference, and these seniors, the kids, the prisoners are usually, of course, the marginalized, disenfranchised people who you never hear from. There's also amazing heroes, and I think of heroes as being these people who just do what they do for the love of the animals and to make the world a better place. This is at the David Sheldrick Elephant Sanctuary outside of Nairobi, Kenya. These keepers stay with these animals 24/7. The animals there are animals who were traumatized. They saw their families brutally ripped apart. They saw their mothers slaughtered and butchered. And these are severely traumatized animals. And one of the ways that you keep them sedate and calm is you put your hand in their mouth and you just stand there. I'm sure Freud would have a lot to say about this. But it's really pretty amazing what these guys do. It's a man named Mohammed on the island of Zanzibar, and out of his own pocket in a town that's probably smaller than this amphitheater, founded a rescue center for herps, reptiles, snakes, amphibians. So I just show you this because these are people who are working against all possible odds, doing amazing things. It's my friend Yasfat in Nairobi. He formed a group called Youth for Conservation. They collect snares. These are snares. Snares are like traps, if you don't know. They're like nooses. Animals run into them, and as they pull, they tighten. So they may get it around an arm and basically have the snare work through the arm and literally sever the arm, or around the neck, or around their belly. So what Joss does is he gets kids in Nairobi to go out and collect snares. That's not like going to a ball game. These kids get shot at, and it's serious. But once again, I show you there are amazing people out there doing amazing things. This is Jill Robinson, and Jill here with Emma, who you met earlier on. Jill founded Animals for Asia, a wonderful group, or Animals Asia, that most of their activities now are devoted to rescuing these moon bears from the Chinese traditional medicine bile industry. And again, Jasper, because you've just got to end on hope. I mean, if there's no hope, as far as I'm concerned, it's all over. If you're fighting factory farming, you're fighting abuse of animals anywhere. If you give up, the animals are screwed. You can't give up. You just got to really just stay hopeful and believe that as a collective effort, if you will, you're chiseling away at abuse. So there can be happy cows. I know this is corny, but it was the best thing I could pop off the web. It's just a counter to the animals that are put in cages. One of my friends likes to say that poultry farmers are always facing the question of how many chickens can you cram into a battery cage with Vaseline. And I'll come back to one of my favorite quotes. And it comes from Erwin Schrödinger, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics. And you can read it, but read it, and it's really beautiful because what it really says is that typically science is silent on everything that's close to our hearts. And so, once again, I make my living as a scientist, and I like doing the science that I do. And I always tell my students that science and compassion and sentimentality are not incompatible. You can do really good science and care for animals in a very deep and heartfelt way. Don't let anybody tell you any other news. You can do it. And what's really rewarding to me as I travel around is that I meet more and more students throughout the world who are doing it. I was in Taiwan, and there was a woman who was an honor student, and she was going to drop out of biology because she was told she could not opt out of a dissection lab. We talked to the professor, and finally he allowed her to do the work without doing the dissection as long as she learned the material. Fair enough. And that may not seem like a big thing here, but that's a huge thing in certain societies. So we felt really good about it. It was just a little notch, if you will. It was tiny. I mean, you know, I was telling some people about it after it happened, and I could tell that they were going, oh yeah, well that's great, what's on TV tonight? And I was thinking, well wait a minute, no, you have to understand this. This is probably the first time in Taipei where this was allowed. So the bottom line that I would leave you with will be that there's no doubt that many animals have deep, passionate lives. There's no doubt that Steve Irwin, I never met him, and said that really deep in his heart. He really cared about animals, and that he was a national hero and actually has changed attitudes towards animals. And I can actually believe that. So I was out on a bike ride a few weeks ago, and somebody mentioned something about it, and I kind of sort of said, well, you know, I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I didn't think that wrestling the, what did he do, alligators, crocodiles? I never even saw him in person, or on TV. Yeah, I mean, seemed to give license to the fact that we could go out and dominate these animals in egregious ways. So I didn't like that. But I had 3 of my friends tell me, and I actually saw the kids recently, that their kids really got into animals and conservation because of him. I don't think he got what he deserved. I don't think any human being in that sense gets what they deserve. I don't know if that answers. Treadwell is the same way. I mean, he did things that were amazing, and he brought a lot of attention to bears and actually had a positive effect on bears in many ways. But I certainly wouldn't have done what he did, maybe because of the chicken. But I mean, I don't think you need to be chicken to just not go out with these animals. Because the other side of the question, of course, is you're intruding in their lives. And that's a very serious question, like that gorilla telling you to stay off of, you know, his land. So I don't know. I mean, I'm glad you asked, and I go back and forth, but the message I'm getting very clearly from people with children is that he had a very positive effect. Kids didn't see the cruelty. They rarely do in that sense. So that's the best answer I can give you. Sir?
I think you maybe hinted at this with the hamster and the snake. But how do you feel about pet food that has meat in it, or like having a snake and meat source of thing, or having a dog and meat in it?
Well, I mean, I think that I mean, you get arguments all the time, but I think that there are non-meat foods that are perfectly good for dogs and other animals. I mean, that would be my answer. I mean, there are brands that I wouldn't buy. You probably don't know about them. And I think that was a second feeding live animals at the zoo. Is there? I don't know. Well, I mean, I certainly don't like that, but I mean, certainly, what's really interesting, and I had a big argument with a zoo director who actually, I would have to say, cared for animals, cared for them in different ways that I did, but certainly wasn't some kind of, you know, crazy nut who liked to abuse animals. But I said, you know, you got to have the animals be preyed on in front of the people. If you want to teach people about the habits, because I've had kids go away and go, wow, you know, I mean, it's not literally this, but almost like, oh, I didn't know that polar bears ate big chunks of frozen salmon. No, I'm serious. The lessons kids learn in zoos are bad that way. So, of course, he said, well, you can't do that. I can't have a lion at the zoo chase a gazelle and disembowel the gazelle in front of people. So,
hi, Mark. I'd like to offer a little comment and then ask you a question. The last question does raise a very profound issue. It is kind of an ethical dilemma for us to try to eat with conscience that life takes from life. Life sustains life. And it concerns me as a veterinarian that many people are trying to turn their carnivorous cats into vegans. And that is, in my book, an example of bad anthropomorphizing. The worst anthropomorphizing I saw was in the Jain Hospital in Old Delhi in India, at the bird sanctuary. There was a small eagle lying there, starving to death, with a bowl full of millet seed and casein, which is kind of milk curds, surrounded by cages and cages and cages of hundreds and hundreds of pigeons. You know, ethics and religious belief, such as Jainism, when we impose them upon animals, can be rather pernicious. Now my question, there's a lot of discussion going on the internet and elsewhere about the dog whisperer, popularized on television, on the National Geographic. I'd love your response to his approach of training and your general views on this.
Well, I have to say it's a rare honor to. Michael Fox was my PhD mentor years ago, and and his daughter was in my class a couple of years ago at the University of Colorado, so it felt really nice to have that lineage. Thanks, Mike. You know, I've never seen the dog whisperer, but there's been a lot written about him that has not been particularly favorable. So I can't say. I mean, I get all these emails and people accuse him of being very dominant, you know, over the dogs and things like that. I can't tell you that. I don't know. I know Mark. Yeah, there was a great editorial in the New York Times by Mark Durr a couple of weeks ago that was extremely critical of the dog whisperer. I have a certain skepticism about people like, no, I don't mean people as people like he is. I don't know him. He could be a great guy. But I have a little skepticism about that. I don't know. I mean, like, there are just some people who claim that they have all these great connections to animals, blah, 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 but then they go out and treat them in very non-ethological ways. And I think your point about the veganism in cats is a really good one. It's a very complex one. Thank you. Yeah?
Yeah, I had a thought about, like, you're comparing animals and humans a lot, like their emotions, and I think that's successful to a certain extent. Although, when it comes to like mothering and infancy, I was thinking about like the social movement on like feminism and stuff, and I was like, yeah, I can totally see that it's like shitty to, I mean, I'm not for taking away infants from mothers, so not the issue, but what my point is that how, I mean, I kind of feel like it's kind of dangerous in some certain ways to like always go like talk about the biological sides of behavior, because like I can see like fathers bonding to their children in as strong ways with humans and animals, for example.
Thank you. That's a good point. I didn't mean to exclude that. I just was using that as an example because it turns out that the research that I was talking about is always been mother-infant separation. There's almost no research, I mean, there might be some, but really the big work that John Bowlby and other psychologists have done, and that Harlow and his students has been taking young animals away from their mothers.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah.
I'm from Montana for 15 or so years in the zoo. I halfway between Glacier National Park and Yellowstone. And every summer, it was the same thing with papers. I'm sure you saw things like this out of Colorado, where people were coming from all over the world doing crazy things. Unfortunately, it's in lab. People trying to put infants on top of bison to take their pictures. And photographers being bored by male deer because they were interfering with them. I mean, I actually got killed in this particular instance I'm thinking of. I understand and I agree with animals have feelings. We have to deal with them in a different way than we have. But how do we do that and not cause this type of thing that goes on where people are just being stupid? I mean, they don't seem to read, don't feed the grizzly bear. Oh, gee, our car window got broken by a grizzly bear. Are you feeding it? No, I wasn't feeding a grizzly bear. Well, yes, you were. I mean, and then America's Funniest Home Videos did that all the time. Right? Absolutely nuts. And I don't know how to meet somewhere where the important ways of dealing with animals don't get lost because, oh, they're so cute, I want to kill.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question, and that's one of the really difficult areas, because on the one hand, you have situations where it's very clear that close-up experience with animals really helps bond us to them. On the other hand, you can't get that close-up experience. So I'm not quite sure, but I think one way as a biologist would be to put it out there that, you know, these animals are, if they live in their own world, they live in their own groups, and that you are intruding on them. It gets back to this sort of Steve Irwin, Tim Treadwell thing. But I also think that, once again, one real inroad is kids. I mean, is that teaching kids the notion of respect and dignity, that it's not, you take away the dignity of an animal by intruding into her life, you take away respect by intruding in, and bison don't usually run around with little toddlers on their back, but that's how. I mean, you're right, it's so hard because it's just been shown over and over again the importance of direct experience, but direct experience doesn't have to be throwing a kid on the back of a bison. No, right. And don't feed wild animals. I live in the mountains, so I actually have mountain lions right at my house, and I've been as close as I am to all, like this 3 times. And it hurt me to mountain lions. And a bear come on my deck a couple of months ago, tried to open my sliding glass door, and it was odd because we hadn't had bears there that much. But my neighbor was putting his garbage out, and he had a bear-proof garbage can, and it broke, so he didn't get a new one. He just put it out. No-brainer. The whole summer there have been bears right near me, and it's nice to see them, but I really don't want them there, and it's not good for them. So don't feed animals. Well, alternate.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, I want to say thanks a lot for the lecture. Very inspiring. Thank you, slides. You do have a lot. When I was a child, I had a living, well, as Alabama before this, so I got to spend a lot of time outdoors. So I continue to be interested in watching shows, and the shows are very important. Jacques Cousteau, National Geographic. There's one show I saw, this blew my mind, and I wish I had a video of it. It was a ship, I don't know if it was a whaling ship or a fishing ship. It was approached by these 2 killer whales. And they came up and they made contact with the people on the ship. And then they left. And they both came back, believe it or not, each with a shark in his mouth. And presented them to the people on the ship. So the scientists of the film, of course, are saying, I think they were trying to communicate. And then they had to, double back and say, well, we can't really make that up. But I wish I had video of that. And that's why I thank you, to have visions or stuff. We haven't, it's hard to go someplace and see these animals.
Thank you. There's also this great example of about a year ago, a whale got caught in netting off of the coast of California. Humpback, I think. I can't remember the name. So a group of 5 guys went in, rescued her to get the netting. She was all entangled. And they got the netting off, and she went around to each of them and winked systematically. And the neat thing about the story is these weren't, 5 men who had any great feeling for the animals or anything, but they independently described that she actually just winked at each of them and then swam off. I don't know. Let's go to this mic. We'll just alternate.
What she does is when I get mad, what I does, she knows I'm mad. She will not stay away from me. She just gets as possible. And like, when I piss somebody off, I'm going to stay away because, I don't want to be by them. My God's lucky I wouldn't hear it because, she's coming right up through the table. I was hostile to me. Suicide. What is she thinking of doing that?
I don't know because I'd have to meet her, but she probably knows that you won't hit her, and that's her way of just being close, and that whole notion of proximity, touch. Humans are so out of touch with touch. There's no other way to put it. But animals like that. If you watch when wolves lie together, or other animals, they'll always have parts of their bodies touching one another. But I think it's maybe because she knows you're not going to hit her. It's clear that you're angry with her. You have to ask the dog whisperer. Thank you.
Can you give comment on stabling horses and keeping them to ride? Treating them respectfully, but keeping them in a stable and pasturing them and everything.
No. My general ethic is that I don't like things like that. But then again, there's a lot of things that I personally don't like that are happening. Maybe some people will say that I'm a defeatist and I'm giving up on hope, but I don't think I am. I just don't know what to say about situations like that, because if the animals are kept well and they're exercised and they're respected and they are allowed some free will, some predetermination, that's okay. But on the other hand, I don't like to think about animals being enclosed in small little cages. What do you think?
Well, I would suppose that I would have no problem keeping horses if they were allowed to come and go from their stable.
Sure.
It's like an open door in the smell to their pasture, in and out, well fed.
And that's what I meant by having that freedom of choice. Those are hard questions. Because so much of what's happening to animals is so ingrained in society. There's big arguments that we shouldn't have dogs and cats. There are people who favor just basically not any longer having no more breeding and not obviously killing the animals who exist. That's a great question. I was actually in Spain when that happened. I was at an animal protection meeting. I think that if I were getting involved, and probably thank goodness I'm not, but I would use the notion of sentience, feeling pain, being conscious, and having emotional lives, to really make the point that there are very marked similarities between us and many other animals. And I was a member, I guess I still am, of the Great Ape Project that focused only on the great apes. I'm sure you know about that. And if you will, pick and choose very carefully your battles. So in other words, as a member of the Grade 8 project, I was one of the few non-primatologists, and I kept saying to Peter Singer, we got to have other animals to be agreed, but you got to start somewhere. But the reason I say that, I think it's important. There's a woman named Rebecca Dresser. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's a lawyer, and she works with groups of people called missing persons, senile persons, people with Alzheimer's or dementia. And she actually has written a wonderful monograph called Missing Persons, in which she uses research and data on animal sentience to argue for, if you will, the rights and protection of these of these people who are they're non-consenting. They don't have autonomy. So that's where I would go. Rebecca Dresser, D-R-E-S-S-E-R. She's at Washington University. But it's fascinating because when I talk to her, she's using all the stuff on animal emotions and animal sentience to argue for the protection of people who are demented. You bet.
Temple Grandin,
yeah,
in her book Animals in Translation, touches a bit about upon the complex relationship with animals, particularly domesticated animals. And you mentioned what she talks about relatively humane. I was wondering if you could comment upon your vision of our role, wild animals versus domesticated animals. You've already kind of hinted towards that. Do we have a different role? Do we just stop breeding domesticated animals, go back to hunting? What is your view on that?
Well, I suppose in the best of all possible worlds, we probably at some point would just stop breeding the animals and they just wouldn't exist. But more and more I've become a realist. And I mean seriously, because I think we need to be. It's complex and it's a big world and it's multicultural. What I think here in America doesn't even have any much application at all in places like Africa or China, India. Some people argue that we have, let me get this right, some philosophers, who, by the way, have never watched animals, argue that we have greater duties to wild animals, that domesticated animals are just artifacts, blah, 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 blah. I actually think you can turn that argument 180. I mean, I think I have greater duties, if you will, to domesticated dogs than I do to wild wolves. I'm not sure, I mean, I'm not saying I really believe that it's greater, maybe equal, but I surely don't have less of an obligation to respect the lives of domesticated animals. After all, they're here because of the activities of collective humans over eons. So I think we need to be very, very careful about that, because it's not like a domestic, I actually wrote a paper about this, it's not like a domesticated dog suffers less than a wild wolf. In fact, you could argue they suffer more because of the expectations they have about their relationship with humans. So that's the way I would look at it. The other question, though, I don't know where to go on it. I mean, I just don't consider it like my field of expertise. But I do think we need to be very careful. I'm sure many people here have traveled around the world. You've got to really take into account local cultural values. When I was in Africa, you just see things and you just go nuts, and you always go, stop, stop. This is their land. This is their culture. And their notion of humaneness, if you will, might be different. Their notion of having an animal ethic might be different. Their notion of starving is radically different. So I just mentioned that.
I think what's affecting me most tonight is this slaughtering of the cows. I'm not certainly thinking of becoming one, but I'm wondering, since people in this country aren't going to give up meat, in the near future anyway, what is a somewhat, if there's any way possible, of killing animals, cows, to gas them or inject them or something? I mean, what can we do about that?
That's a fair question, because you're right, that is the real question. Yeah, I suppose there are more, there are more or less humane ways of taking an animal's life, no doubt about it. But I actually, sometimes I just vacillate. I don't know. The world's not going to become vegetarian, the entire world. It's just too complex. It's too multicultural. It's too whatever you want to call it. But I actually think that here, maybe right in this room, if you will. But here in the global sense of sort of the West, I think it's actually possible to become vegetarian. And I think it's very possible really easily. And I think it's easy in the sense of weaning yourself, if you will, oneself off of a diet into another diet. So I always just tell people, well, don't say you can't do it. If you eat 4 cheeseburgers a week, start eating 3 for a month, and then 2. So that's a way. I mean, I have a problem with the meat thing, not only because of the way the animals are treated, but I also just, it's the taking of a life. In other words, you can, it's worse, of course, to slaughter the animals the way that they're slaughtered and electrocuted and stunned. And of course, they aren't, and half of them are alive and they get their throats slit or something. But it's also the taking of life. It's the taking of a life, no matter how humane or how conscious you are in doing it. So I would encourage you to try. I mean, I do. I just think it's possible, and I think if enough people do it, not everyone will do it, but if you cut back on your consumption, then it will make a world of difference. It just does. I mean, the pocketbook is really the bottom line. The way we consume and what we buy is what really dictates the market, if you will. I appreciate what you said. It's hard. It is. Ma'am.
Recently, a bill has been brought to our local government in regard to equine populations, and they're being brought to forced slaughterhouses, basically. Mostly the individuals that either one finish at the racetrack and are broken down and can't find rescue homes, to rescues that are overcrowded and can't take on anymore, and still be able to help the individuals that they have in their care. 3, people who have horses who probably shouldn't and don't know what to do with the animals. I'm torn between humanely ending a life of an animal who's going to be tortured by, prods and other things, or malnutrition. But I'm also, loving my animal and thinking, God, I really don't want her to go. I would hate for her to be sold to someone possibly and then sent to one of these places. It's kind of it's a hard place to be in to try to figure out what is correct, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Easy questions. Well, I actually agree with you, and I certainly get into arguments, and I could use myself as an example. I'd rather have a shorter, high-quality life than a longer, miserable life. I personally, that would be my preference, and I agree with you that I think it could be easy to argue that there are situations where you can avoid suffering and interminable suffering by, if you will, some kind of humane death. That's how I feel about it. I mean, we do that all the time with dogs in terms of deciding when to, quote, put a dog to sleep. We do that all the time. And I wrote an essay on this, and I wrote it when I had to put my dog Jethro to sleep. I had lived with many other dogs, but he was real close. I was living alone, and so he was my buddy for years. And really, it was called Letting a Friend Go. And it was kind of getting back to the question about domesticated animals. I mean, he was totally dependent on me. Could I have kept him alive another month or 2, maybe even 6 months? Well, sure. But he would go outside, he couldn't stand, he'd go to the bathroom, he'd fall in a pile of feces, he couldn't hold food down. Every now and again he showed a spark of hope. He chased a squirrel, chased a bunny. His time was up. Do I have any regrets for doing what I did when I put him to sleep, if you will? No. Because he depended on me. And maybe I saw little signs in his behavior that changed, that he was almost telling me he didn't feel well and it was about time to do it. On the one hand, on the other hand, it was totally up to me. And that's where when I ended my talk about our big brains. We're just big-brained mammals. We're ubiquitous, we're all over the place, so we have amazing responsibilities. But I agree with you. People, I don't know, my mom was ill for about 10 years and died about 2 years ago, and she went through a series of minor strokes to the point where she was just basically, as they say, a human vegetable. She could chew and breathe. We decided not to treat her for some infection, and she died. Well, I mean, could she have lived another 2 months? Well, sure she could have. Big deal. And I really, love her, but I mean, it was time. So we're making those decisions all the time, and I think a humane exit is fine with me. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe a good question. Yeah. Is this a hard one or an easy one? Okay. Yeah.
So there's a lot of we relate with animals if we find that they have human characteristics. And it's like, oh, they have this characteristic. So I guess my question was, you see a lot of people run out into nature, onto the wild, and studying animals or entering into their space. And each individual has their goal about doing that. But I'm curious about actual other species, other animals, even bigger than other animals. From hearing the stories or experiences of their own curiosity with other species besides humans, and their approach to the way that they enter into that relationship.
That's a good question. I will make one comment, though. I don't know if you were implying that I was saying it or others, but I'm not saying that because we are similar, they are similar to us, we should respect them and all that. And as a biologist, like I started the talk, I'm arguing they have their own lives, they have their own emotions. The reason, and really you're raising a really important point, and I think it relates to the question about law, is many people really live in the world by arguments from analogy. If we are similar to them, or if they are similar to us, then it would be easier to grant them rights or protection. So I just want to make that clear, okay? The other question, though, is a really good one. Among birds, there's lots of examples of hybridization between different species and curiosity. But also among animals, I mean, it depends how you want to look at it in terms of positive or negative interactions. Wolves in Yellowstone, one part of Yellowstone in the Lamar Valley killed almost all the coyotes who were there when the wolves were reintroduced. Okay? But I've seen wolves will play with coyotes. I've seen coyotes play with red fox. But what you see, and like in Africa, you'll see mixed groups of animals all the time. Especially the herbivores. Some of them flock for protection. Some of them just flock because that's where their food is and they're grazing. So I'm not quite sure if you're asking whether you see between species interactions.
There's a lot of dolphin, we see dolphins in the water and either species interact with other species.
Yes. I mean, what you really see, and this is just a real pure question about sort of the way animals live, is very often you don't see members of different species interact because they're either very territorial or they're just basically in a place and other animals can't get in. But I think the example I gave, like the lioness adopting a gazelle, the hippo and the tortoise, there's a great story of a big grizzly and a cat who play with one another. Yeah. In fact, I can just give you a whole list of references where you can find stuff. There's a great story of a donkey who leads a blind steer around at a sanctuary, I think, in Colorado. In the wild, there's much more serious consequences for trespassing into another animal's territory, for example. So, is it a matter of respect, as I might respect, say, the rights or privileges or interests of a dog? I think it's different that way, because the consequences of one wolf going into the territory of another wolf is a lot larger. Well, I don't know if your state has the Make My Day law. but no, seriously, but that's how. But a lot of it's a great question. A lot of the spatial relationships among different species and within species is determined by food distribution. That's known. So sometimes there's just not enough food to support, and they space out, if you will, because of the way in which food is allocated. Thank you. Okay, one more.
Okay, I'm just going to make some quick announcements, and then we can either continue with Q&A or Mark will just email everything and ask more questions. I just wanted to quick announce that there's food in the lobby once we're all done in here. And anyone who took the veg pledge for the week to be vegetarian or vegan for the next 7 days, you can pick up your care package outside. And for anyone else who's interested and been inspired either by Mark's talk or by other information, you can also take the pledge. And there's information out on the tables outside. And also through CAA, we have a lot of really great information just on being vegetarian or vegan, about farming industry. So you can start, gathering materials. Okay, let's see. Oh, and if you could fill out the event survey forms that are in your program, that would be wonderful. And also, we'd like to thank all of our great sponsors that are in the back of the program, as well as our grants, GATSA, MSA, SAO Partnership Grant. So that's all I have to say.